The sky above was dull and gray, stretching endlessly over the ruined planet. Dust swirled in the dry wind, covering the broken ground in a thick layer of red sand. This place was once full of life, but now it was nothing more than a graveyard of fallen machines and shattered buildings. Thomas, a human soldier, moved carefully through the wasteland. His boots crunched against the dirt as he scanned the area with sharp eyes. He was sent here to check for survivors, though he didn't expect to find any. The war had ended, and most people had already left this dying world behind. Still, orders were orders. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow and adjusted the rifle on his back. His radio crackled. "Report back if you find anything." "Copy that," Thomas replied, but he doubted he would find anything worth reporting. Then something caught his attention. A small, half-buried escape pod lay a few meters ahead, its surface covered in scorch marks and dents. Smoke rose from its broken engine, and its hatch was slightly open, as if someone had tried to escape but collapsed before getting far. Thomas approached cautiously, his hand resting near his sidearm. He had seen many abandoned ships before, but something about this one felt different. He reached the pod and peeked inside. His breath caught. A girl, an alien girl, lay unconscious inside. Her skin was pale blue, almost like the color of the sky before a storm. Her silver hair was tangled, and her clothes were torn, revealing deep bruises along her arms. She was young, maybe in her late teens, and her delicate features were twisted in pain. Thomas knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. She was breathing, but barely. Her pulse was weak. "Hey," he said softly, shaking her shoulder. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Thomas hesitated. He knew what he was supposed to do: report the find and wait for orders. But something inside him refused to leave her here. Whoever she was, she had been left behind, abandoned like the wreckage around them. And Thomas knew what it felt like to be abandoned. With a sigh, he lifted her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her fragile body barely stirring. As he held her, her breathing became slower and panic rose in his chest. "You're not dying today," he muttered. He carried her away from the wreckage, moving quickly toward his small camp nearby. It wasn't much, just a tent, some supplies, and a weak signal beacon, but it would have to do. When he reached the shelter, he laid her down on a blanket and grabbed his medical kit. Carefully, he treated her wounds, cleaning the cuts and wrapping the deeper ones with bandages. She flinched slightly at his touch, but she didn't wake. Thomas sat back, watching her. Who was she? How had she ended up here? And why had no one come looking for her? As he thought, the radio on his belt crackled again. "Thomas, status update." He hesitated, then pressed the button. "Found a damaged escape pod. No survivors." A pause. Then, "Copy that. Return when ready." Thomas turned off the radio. He knew he had just lied to his superiors. If they knew about her, they might take her away for questioning, or worse. He wasn't sure why, but the thought of that made his stomach twist. As night fell, the cold crept into the wasteland. Thomas wrapped another blanket around the girl and sat beside her. The stars above twinkled faintly, distant and silent. Then, suddenly, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, bright violet, glowing softly in the dim light. For a moment, confusion filled them, then fear. She tried to move, but her weak body betrayed her. Hey, Thomas said quickly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. I found you in the wreckage." Her breathing was fast and uneven. She tried to speak, but no words came out, only a soft, pained whisper. Thomas grabbed his water bottle and held it to her lips. "Here, drink." She hesitated before taking the small sip, then coughed. Her gaze stayed locked onto his, watching him with a mix of caution and exhaustion. Thomas sighed. "I don't know if you understand me, but I won't hurt you. You were left behind, weren't you?" Her expression flickered. Was that sadness She lowered her gaze and slowly nodded. That single motion told him everything. Thomas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, I guess that makes two of us. He sat beside her in silence. The night stretched on, and the wind howled through the broken landscape. The girl closed her eyes again, but this time her breathing was steadier. Thomas looked at her, then up at the stars. Whoever had left her here had made a mistake. Because now she was his responsibility, and he wasn't going to leave her behind. Morning came slowly. The pale light of the rising sun spread across the empty wasteland. Cold winds blew dust across the ground. The planet felt silent, forgotten by all. In the small shelter, Thomas sat by the entrance, watching the horizon. He had not slept. His eyes were tired, but he stayed alert. Inside the shelter, the alien girl, Rhea, still slept. Her breathing was steady now, better than last night. Thomas glanced back at her. He wondered who she really was. Why was she left behind? Why had no one returned for her? Rhea stirred. Slowly, her violet eyes blinked open. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling of the shelter, confused. Then her gaze shifted and fell on Thomas. Thomas raised his hands calmly. Hey, you're okay. I mean no harm. Rhea tensed. Her fingers gripped the blanket tightly. Fear flickered in her eyes. She tried to sit up but winced, clutching her side. Careful, Thomas said, moving closer but slowly. You're still hurt. Rhea shook her head weakly. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Thomas sighed. You don't understand me, do you? He pointed at himself. Thomas. Then he pointed at her. You? Rhea watched him for a long moment. Her lips parted. A soft whisper escaped. Rhea. Thomas blinked in surprise. Rhea? That's your name. Rhea nodded slowly, her expression cautious. Okay, Rhea. Nice to meet you, Thomas said with a faint smile. You had a rough time, huh? Rhea tilted her head, watching his face. She still looked unsure. Thomas stood and poured water into a small cup. Here, drink this. You need it. He held the cup out. Rhea looked at it, then at him. Slowly, she reached for it. Her hand shook slightly, but she took a small sip. Good, Thomas said. See, I'm not your enemy. Rhea lowered the cup. She looked at Thomas again, studying him. Her violet eyes were sharp, searching for any sign of danger. Thomas pointed at her bandaged arm. I fixed you up. You were hurt pretty bad. Rhea looked at her arm. She touched the bandages gently, her fingers brushing the clean wraps. Her eyes softened just a little. Thomas smiled. Yeah, you're welcome. For a while, neither of them spoke. Thomas stepped outside the shelter. He scanned the horizon again. The radio on his belt crackled with static. Patrol teams report back. Any survivors found? Thomas hesitated before switching the radio off. He wasn't ready to tell anyone about Rhea yet. He looked back inside. Rhea was sitting up now, still weak but more alert. She was looking at the sky through the small window of the shelter. Her eyes seemed distant, filled with sadness. Thomas sat at the entrance again. So you were left behind, he said softly, just like this planet. Rhea didn't respond, but her fingers tightened around the blanket. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed across the wasteland. Boom. Thomas jumped to his feet. He stepped outside, squinting into the distance. Smoke rose far off on the horizon. Not good, Thomas muttered. He turned to Rhea. We need to move. Rhea looked at him, confused. Thomas pointed toward the rising smoke. Trouble. We can't stay here. Rhea hesitated. She looked down at her weak arms and legs. Thomas stepped inside. Can you walk? Rhea tried to stand. She took one shaky step before stumbling. Thomas caught her before she fell. Easy, he said. Guess I'm carrying you again. Carefully, Thomas lifted her. She was still light, her frame fragile. Rhea stiffened in his arms, but she didn't resist. "Hang on," Thomas said. "We'll find a safer place." The journey was slow. Thomas carried Rhea across the rocky ground, moving toward the distant hills. The sun rose higher, making the air dry and hot. Rhea watched him silently as he walked. She seemed puzzled. "Yeah, I know," Thomas said between breaths. "Why help you, right? Why not leave you behind like everyone else?" Rhea didn't answer, but her gaze softened. Thomas looked ahead. "Because leaving someone behind, that's something I can't do." Hours passed. Thomas stopped near a cluster of large rocks. He set Rhea down carefully in the shade. "Rest here," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Rhea looked around, then back at Thomas. Thomas smiled faintly. "Still don't trust me, huh?" Rhea lowered her gaze but didn't pull away when Thomas checked her bandages. Suddenly, a faint sound reached their ears. Voices. Thomas stiffened. He peered over the rocks. In the distance, a group of scavengers moved among the wreckage. They weren't soldiers. Scavengers hunted for anything valuable. Machines, supplies, sometimes even people. Thomas's jaw tightened. Not good. He looked at Rhea. "We need to stay quiet." Rhea nodded slowly, understanding the danger in his tone. Thomas crouched beside her, listening carefully. The scavengers were getting closer. "We can't fight them," Thomas whispered. "We have to hide." He pointed to a narrow gap between the rocks. "In there." Rhea looked at the gap, and then at Thomas. She seemed afraid, but she trusted him enough now to move. With effort, they squeezed into the small space. The shadows hid them well. The voices grew louder. Thomas held his breath. He felt Rhea's trembling hand clutch his sleeve. The scavengers passed by, their footsteps echoing. Thomas and Rhea stayed still, not moving a muscle. Minutes passed. The voices faded. Thomas finally exhaled. "They're gone." Rhea loosened her grip on his sleeve, but her eyes still showed fear. Thomas gave her a reassuring smile. "Told you. You're safe with me." For the first time, Rhea smiled. Small, but real. Thomas looked at her in surprise. "Hey," he said softly, "you smiled." Rhea looked away quickly, but Thomas grinned. "That's progress." He stood and offered his hand to her. "Come on, let's keep moving." Rhea looked at his hand for a moment, then reached out and took it. Thomas helped her to her feet. Together, they stepped out of the shadows and into the light. Their journey had only just begun. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the wasteland. The air grew cooler, but the danger had not passed. Thomas walked slowly, guiding Rhea along the rocky path. Rhea leaned on him for support. Though still weak, she was trying hard to walk on her own. Thomas admired her strength. "You're doing great," Thomas said with a small smile. "Not much farther now." Rhea glanced at him, her violet eyes filled with determination. She still didn't speak much, but Thomas could see the change in her. She wasn't as afraid anymore. In the distance, the land rose into sharp hills. Thomas knew there were caves there, good places to hide for the night. They needed rest. The scavengers from earlier might still be searching, and he didn't want to take any chances. As they walked, Thomas noticed strange marks on the ground, burned lines, and broken metal pieces. "What's this?" he murmured. Rhea stopped beside him. She looked at the wreckage and froze. Her eyes widened with fear. Thomas turned to her. "You recognize this, don't you?" Rhea hesitated, then nodded slowly. She pointed at a broken symbol on a piece of metal, a circle with 3 lines through it. Thomas studied it. "Is this from your people?" Rhea's face grew sad. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. Thomas sighed. "I get it. This must have been part of your ship." Rhea nodded again, lowering her gaze. Thomas looked around. The area felt wrong. The air was too still. The marks on the ground weren't from a crash. They were from a fight. "Let's move," Thomas said, "We shouldn't stay here." But before they could take another step, a sharp noise echoed in the distance. Beep, beep. Thomas stopped. His eyes narrowed. The sound came from a ridge above them. "Rhea, get behind me." Rhea did as he said, though she looked confused. From the ridge, shadows appeared, scavengers. There were 4 of them. Dressed in dark clothes, their faces covered with masks. They carried tools meant for breaking machines, but could easily be used for other purposes. Thomas's jaw tightened. The scavengers spotted them and began to descend the slope. "Not good," Thomas muttered. He turned to Rhea. "Run when I say so, okay?" Rhea looked at him, fear returning to her eyes. "I'll distract them," Thomas said. "You head for the caves. I'll catch up." But Rhea shook her head. She didn't want to leave him. Thomas smiled faintly. "Don't worry. I'll be fine. Trust me." The scavengers were getting closer. Thomas had no weapons. He had left his rifle at the shelter. Fighting wasn't an option. Then Thomas spotted something, a narrow path between 2 large rocks leading down to the caves. If they could reach it, the scavengers would have a hard time following. "Now," Thomas shouted. He grabbed Rhea's hand, and they ran. The scavengers yelled behind them, giving chase. Thomas and Rhea raced toward the path. The ground was uneven, and Rhea stumbled. Thomas caught her before she fell. "Keep going," he urged. They reached the narrow path. Thomas pushed Rhea ahead of him. The scavengers were close now, too close. Suddenly, one of the scavengers threw a small device. It landed near Thomas and beeped rapidly. "Down," Thomas shouted. He covered Rhea with his body just as the device flashed, sending a shockwave through the air. The rocks around them shook. When the dust cleared, Thomas groaned and stood. Rhea was unharmed, but the path behind them had collapsed. The scavengers couldn't follow now. "We made it," Thomas said, breathing hard. Rhea looked at him with wide eyes. Slowly, she reached out and touched his arm, her way of saying thank you. Thomas smiled. "Told you I'd keep you safe." The cave was deep and cool. Small lights from Thomas's wrist device lit the walls. Thomas set up a small fire using a heating tool. Rhea sat nearby, watching the flames. "That was close," Thomas said, sitting beside her. "Too close." Rhea stared into the fire. Then she looked at Thomas and pointed to herself, then to the cave wall. "You want to tell me something?" Thomas asked. Rhea nodded. She placed her hand on the cave wall. Her fingertips glowed faintly. Thomas leaned forward, watching in surprise. The wall shimmered, and a faint image appeared. A large ship, surrounded by stars. People like Rhea stood aboard it. Rhea pointed to a smaller figure among them. Herself. "That's you," Thomas whispered. Rhea nodded. Then the image changed. Ships appeared, different ones, attacking. There was fire, smoke, and darkness. Rhea's figure was shown running, then alone. Thomas understood. "You were running from them. You escaped but crashed here." Rhea lowered her hand. The image faded. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "So your own people left you behind. Or maybe they couldn't find you." Rhea didn't respond. Thomas looked at her. "But you survived. And I found you. That means something." Rhea met his gaze. There was still sadness in her eyes, but also a flicker of hope. Thomas leaned back. "We'll figure this out. Together." He glanced toward the cave entrance. "But those scavengers won't give up so easily. We'll have to move again soon." Rhea looked outside, her glowing eyes thoughtful. For now, they were safe. But Thomas knew the real danger was still out there. And soon, they would have to face it. The cave was quiet, with only the soft crackle of the small fire breaking the silence. Thomas sat near the flames, sharpening a metal rod he had found. It wasn't much, but it could serve as a weapon if the scavengers returned. Rhea sat close by, her silver hair glowing faintly in the firelight. She traced shapes on the cave floor with her finger. Circles, lines, and symbols Thomas didn't understand. "Those signs again," Thomas said, glancing at her. "They mean something, don't they?" Raya looked up at him, her violet eyes thoughtful. She pointed at the largest circle she had drawn. Thomas leaned closer. "What's that?" "Your home." Rhea nodded slowly. Thomas smiled. "A place worth going back to." But Raya's face darkened. She pointed to the circle again, then drew a jagged line across it. Thomas frowned. "Destroyed?" Raya didn't answer, but the sadness in her eyes was enough. Thomas sat back, rubbing the back of his neck. "So there's no going back. Not for you." Raya lowered her gaze. The wind outside howled softly, carrying dust through the narrow cave entrance. Thomas broke the silence. "Maybe we don't need to go back. We can go somewhere new." Raya looked at him, curious. Thomas shrugged. "The galaxy is big. There's always somewhere to start over. But first," he reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, a signal communicator. "This might be our way out," he said. "If I can fix it, we can send a message. Someone friendly might hear it." Raya leaned forward, studying the device. Thomas laughed lightly. "Don't get too hopeful. It's old, and I'm no engineer, but it's worth a shot." Rhea touched the communicator. Her fingertips glowed faintly again. Thomas raised his eyebrows. "Wait, can you fix it?" Rhea pressed her hand against the device. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft hum, the communicator's screen lit up. Thomas stared. "You've got to be kidding me." Rhea gave a small smile. "Well, that's helpful," Thomas said, impressed. "Guess I don't have to do everything myself." The screen flickered. A weak signal appeared, faint but real. Thomas adjusted the settings. "If I boost the signal just a little, maybe someone will pick it up." Suddenly, the screen flashed again, and a faint voice came through. "Emergency signal detected." Thomas froze. "Did you hear that?" Raya's eyes widened. "Coordinates received. Sending rescue ship." Thomas blinked. "Rescue ship." That was fast. But before he could celebrate, the voice continued. "Warning. Hostile forces also tracking signal. Proceed with caution." The message repeated. Thomas's smile faded. "Hostile forces. Scavengers." He looked at Raya. "They must have picked up the signal too. They'll come for us. And the rescue ship." Raya stood slowly, her face serious. Thomas grabbed his pack. "We can't stay here. We need to meet that rescue ship before the scavengers do." He checked the communicator. "Coordinates say it'll land near the old ruins, 2 hours from here." Raya looked toward the cave entrance and nodded. "All right," Thomas said, tightening the straps on his pack. "Let's move." The journey through the rocky hills was tough. The ground was uneven, and sharp winds blew dust into their faces. Thomas led the way, keeping a close eye on the communicator. The signal was weak but steady. Raya followed, moving with more strength than before. Her injuries were healing fast, faster than Thomas had expected. "You're tougher than you look," Thomas said with a grin. Raya gave a small nod, though her face stayed serious. As they climbed a ridge, Thomas paused. "There," he said, pointing ahead. Below them lay the old ruins, broken stone buildings covered in sand. In the center, a wide clearing stretched out, perfect for a ship to land. "We're close," Thomas said, "just a little further." But Rhea tugged his sleeve, pointing in the opposite direction. Thomas turned. His smile faded. On the far side of the ruins, dark shapes were moving. "The scavengers. They're coming," Thomas whispered. The scavengers moved quickly, climbing down from their transport vehicle. They had seen the ruins too. Thomas looked at Rhea. "We have to beat them there." They ran. The wind howled louder now, and the ruins seemed to rise like ghosts from the sand. Thomas pushed forward, his breath coming hard. The communicator beeped faster. "The ship's close." Thomas shouted. But so were the scavengers. Thomas and Raya reached the clearing. The wind blew harder, and a low hum filled the air. Thomas looked up. A small rescue ship was descending from the sky, its lights cutting through the dust. "We made it," Thomas said, grinning. But the scavengers were right behind them. Thomas turned to Rhea. "Stay behind me." The ship touched down with a soft thud. The doors began to open. But before anyone could step out, the scavengers rushed into the clearing. Thomas stood tall, gripping his metal rod. "You're not taking her." The scavengers slowed when they saw the rescue ship, unsure what to do. Then Raya stepped forward. "Rhea." "No," Thomas started. But Rhea raised her hand. Her fingertips glowed brighter than ever before. The scavengers stopped, watching with wide eyes. A soft hum filled the air. The rescue ship's lights glowed brighter in response. Thomas stared. "What?" The ship seemed to recognize Rhea. A calm voice echoed from the ship. "Passenger identified. Welcome home, Rhea." Thomas turned to her, stunned. "Home? But you said—" Rhea looked at Thomas, her eyes soft. She reached for his hand. Together, they stepped toward the ship. The scavengers backed away, realizing they were no match for this. The ship's doors opened wide, welcoming them in. As Thomas and Rhea entered, the scavengers vanished into the dust, defeated. Thomas looked at Rhea. "Guess you weren't as lost as we thought." Rhea smiled for real this time, bright, full of hope. The doors closed. The ship rose, and together they left the wasteland behind. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, Thomas knew they were headed somewhere better. The rescue ship flew smoothly through the dark sky. Below them, the desert wasteland disappeared, and above them, stars began to shine. Thomas sat by the window, staring out at the endless space. He had never been on a ship like this before. The walls glowed softly, and the air smelled clean. Rhea sat beside him, her violet eyes watching him closely. For the first time since Thomas had found her, she seemed calm, almost happy. Thomas broke the silence. "So, this is your ship." Rhea gave a small nod. Thomas looked around. "Does anyone else live here, or is it just you?" Rhea pointed at a large door at the back of the room. Thomas stood and walked toward it. As he got closer, the door slid open with a soft hiss. Behind it was a wide room filled with glowing panels and tall screens. Strange symbols covered the walls. In the center, a large crystal floated, spinning slowly. Thomas stared. "What is this place?" Rhea followed him in. She stepped toward the crystal, placing her hand near it. The crystal glowed brighter. Suddenly, a soft voice filled the room. "Welcome, Rhea. Systems fully operational. Awaiting instructions." Thomas jumped back. Did the ship just talk? Rhea smiled and nodded. Thomas rubbed his head. "Right. Of course it talks. Why wouldn't it?" The voice spoke again. "Human detected. Scanning. No threat found. Welcome aboard, Thomas." Thomas blinked. "It knows my name." Rhea pointed at the crystal, then at Thomas. "Wait," Thomas said. "Did you tell the ship about me?" Rhea shook her head. Thomas frowned. "Then how?" Before he could finish, the crystal projected a glowing map into the air. Thomas stepped closer. The map showed stars, planets, and glowing lines connecting them. Rhea touched one of the glowing lines. The map zoomed in, showing a green and blue planet. Thomas's eyes widened. "That's Earth." Rhea looked at him with a gentle expression. You know about Earth?" Thomas asked, confused. Rhea nodded. Thomas looked back at the map. "But how? Have your people been watching us?" Rhea didn't answer. Instead, she touched another point on the map, a golden star surrounded by strange symbols. The voice spoke again. "Primary destination, Solara. Estimated time of arrival, 12 hours. Thomas crossed his arms. Solara, that's your home, right? Raya's smile faded. She looked down, her face clouded with worry. Thomas noticed. Hey, what's wrong? I thought you'd be happy to go home. Rhea pointed at the star again, then drew a line through it, just like she had done in the cave. Thomas sighed. Still destroyed, huh? Rhea nodded. But then why are we going there? Thomas asked. If there's nothing left. The ship's voice answered this time. Emergency signal from Solara detected. Investigating source. Thomas's eyes narrowed. An emergency signal. From a destroyed planet. Raya looked just as confused. Thomas glanced at her. Maybe. Someone survived. Raya's eyes lit up with hope. Thomas smiled. Then we have to find out. Hours passed. The ship sailed through the stars without trouble. Thomas and Raya sat together in a small room filled with soft chairs and large windows. The stars outside seemed to dance. Do you think we'll find someone there? Thomas asked. Raya looked thoughtful. She pressed her palm to the window, staring at the distant stars. Thomas watched her. You miss them, don't you? Your people. Rhea nodded slowly. Thomas leaned back. I get that. It's hard being alone. Raya turned to him, studying his face. Thomas smiled faintly. But you're not alone now. Rhea smiled too, a real, warm smile. The ship's calm voice returned. Approaching Solara. Prepare for descent. Thomas stood, looking out the window. In the distance, a large planet appeared. But instead of the bright, living world Thomas expected, Solara was dark. Clouds of ash floated in the sky. The land below looked broken, with deep cracks running through it. Thomas felt a chill. What happened here? Raya stood beside him, her face pale. The ship slowed as it entered the planet's atmosphere. Emergency signal location, Central City ruins. Thomas turned to Rhea. Guess that's where we're going. The ship landed softly on a flat, dusty plain. The doors opened with a quiet hiss. Thomas stepped out first. The air smelled like dust and old metal. The ruins stretched before them. Tall towers broken in half, streets filled with rubble, and silence everywhere. Raya followed slowly, her eyes wide with sadness. Thomas turned to her. Hey, we'll find whoever sent that signal. I promise. Rhea nodded. As they walked through the ruined city, Thomas noticed something strange. The buildings weren't just broken. They looked melted. What could have done this? Thomas wondered aloud. Raya didn't answer. She was staring at something up ahead. Thomas followed her gaze. In the middle of the street, a small glowing device lay on the ground, flashing with a soft blue light. The emergency signal, Thomas whispered. Raya rushed forward. Thomas followed, but something made him stop. He looked around. The air felt wrong. Wait, Rita, he called. But Rhea had already reached the device. As soon as she touched it, the ground shook. Thomas ran to her side. What's happening? The device glowed brighter. A voice echoed from it, calm, cold, and unfamiliar. Signal received. Target located. Proceeding with retrieval. Thomas froze. What? Retrieval. Suddenly, a shadow passed over them. Thomas looked up, and his heart stopped. Above the ruins, a massive ship appeared, blocking out the sky. It wasn't the rescue ship. It was something else. Something dangerous. Raya stepped back, her face full of fear. Thomas grabbed her hand. Run. But it was too late. A beam of light shot down from the ship, surrounding them both. Thomas held Raya tightly. I won't let them take you. The light grew brighter. And in a flash, they were gone. Bright light faded slowly. Thomas blinked, trying to see. His head felt heavy. The air was cold and still. When his eyes cleared, he realized they were no longer on Solara. They stood inside a large room, filled with smooth silver walls. Strange machines lined the edges, humming softly. Thomas looked around quickly. Rhea, where are you? Rhea stood nearby, her face pale. She stared at a large glass window. Thomas ran to her side. Are you okay? Rhea pointed through the window. Thomas followed her gaze. Outside the window, Solara floated in the distance, a broken world surrounded by stars. We're on that ship, Thomas whispered. The one that took us. Rhea nodded slowly. Thomas placed a hand on the cold glass. But why? Who are they? Before Rhea could answer, a soft clicking sound echoed in the room. Thomas turned sharply. From the shadows, a tall figure stepped forward. It wasn't human. The figure had long limbs and pale silver skin. Its eyes glowed faintly blue. Thin lines ran across its body, shining softly. Rhea took a step back. Thomas moved in front of her. Stay behind me. The figure raised its hand, and a gentle voice echoed, not from its mouth, but from everywhere. Do not fear. You are safe. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Safe. You took us without asking. The figure paused, tilting its head. The signal brought you here. The girl is the key. Thomas looked back at Rhea. The key? What do you mean? Rhea stared at the figure, her hands clenched. She belongs here, the voice continued. She carries the last spark of Solara. Thomas frowned. Last spark? What does that mean? The figure stepped closer. When Solara fell, only one hope remained. She carries it within her. Rhea looked confused, but her hand glowed faintly as if in response. Thomas turned to her. Is that true? Are they saying you can save Solara? The figure nodded. But the spark is incomplete. To restore Solara, the source must be awakened. Thomas crossed his arms. And where's this source? The figure pointed at the planet outside. Deep beneath Solara's ruins lies the core. The source rests there, but it is locked. Thomas glanced at Rhea. And you think she can unlock it? Only she can. Rhea looked down at her glowing hand. Thomas sighed. Okay, let's go then. Let's fix Solara. The figure lowered its hand. It is not that simple. The core is guarded. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Guarded by what? By what destroyed Solara in the first place. A cold silence followed. Thomas looked back at the window. The broken planet seemed quiet, almost peaceful. But now he knew something dangerous waited below. He turned to Rhea. Are you sure you want to do this? Rhea met his eyes and nodded firmly. Thomas smiled. Then we'll face it together. The tall figure led them through bright hallways. The ship seemed alive. Lights followed their steps, and the walls hummed softly. They reached a round chamber. In its center stood a small transport craft, sleek and silver. This will take you to the planet's core, the figure said. But beware, the darkness still lingers there. Thomas nodded. We'll be careful. The doors of the small craft opened. Thomas turned to Rhea. Ready? Rhea gave a small smile and stepped inside. Thomas followed. The doors closed behind them. With a soft hum, the craft lifted and slid through an opening beneath the larger ship. The journey back to Solara was quiet. Thomas looked at Rhea. She seemed calm but focused. He broke the silence. Hey, if you're scared, it's okay. I am too. Rhea looked at him, then reached out and took his hand gently. Thomas smiled. Guess we're both braver together. The craft slowed. Approaching Solara's core entrance, a soft voice inside the craft announced. Thomas looked outside. They were flying deep into a massive canyon. Its walls blackened and cracked. At the bottom, a wide stone gate glowed faintly. That must be it, Thomas said. The craft landed softly. The doors opened with a soft hiss. The air outside was warm and thick. Thomas stepped out first. This place feels different. They stood before the stone gate. Thomas pointed at them. Rhea, these are your symbols. Rhea stepped forward. The symbols on the gate glowed in response. Thomas watched, holding his breath. Slowly, Rhea raised her hand. The entire gate lit up, shining with soft blue light. A deep hum filled the canyon. Then, with a slow rumble, the gate began to open. Thomas stared into the darkness beyond. But as the gate opened fully, his heart sank. From the shadows inside, something moved. Glowing red eyes appeared, dozens of them. Dark shapes, tall and sharp, stepped forward. Thomas took a step back. Rhea, we've got company. The creatures made no sound. Their bodies seemed made of metal and shadows. Rhea lowered her glowing hand. The creatures stopped. Thomas whispered, "What are they?" Rhea looked at him with fear in her eyes. The largest creature stepped forward. Its eyes glowed brightest of all. A voice echoed, deep and cold. "You should not have returned." Thomas tightened his fists. "We're not leaving. She's here to restore Solara." The creature's red eyes narrowed. "Then you must face the darkness." The shadows closed in. Thomas stood in front of Rhea. "Whatever happens, I won't let them take you." Rhea's hand glowed brighter, stronger than ever. The canyon shook. Light and darkness clashed at the gates of Solara's core. The final test had begun. The canyon shook. Thomas stood firm, shielding Rhea. The tall shadow creatures with glowing red eyes blocked the path to Solara's core. Rhea's hand glowed brighter than ever before. The soft blue light from her palm pushed back the shadows, but the creatures kept coming. The largest creature stepped forward. Its deep voice echoed through the canyon. "The spark will not pass. Solara belongs to the dark." Thomas clenched his fists. "We'll see about that." Rhea touched Thomas's shoulder. Her eyes glowed faintly, filled with determination. Thomas looked at her and smiled. "We'll face them together." The creature raised its arm. The other shadow creatures moved in, silent but fast. Thomas grabbed a long metal rod lying nearby. "Stay close to me." Rhea nodded. Suddenly, the creatures lunged. Rhea raised her glowing hand. A bright shield of blue light formed around them. The creatures struck the shield, but it held strong. Thomas stared in surprise. "You can do that." Rhea gave a small smile. The largest creature let out a low growl. "Her power has awakened. The spark is near. We must stop her now." Thomas looked ahead. Beyond the shadow creatures, a soft golden light shone deep inside the core's passage. "That must be the source," he said. "We just need to get there." Rhea pointed toward the light, agreeing. Thomas tightened his grip on the rod. "Okay, here's the plan. You keep the shield up, and I'll clear a path." Rhea hesitated, but nodded. The shield faded slightly. The creatures rushed in again. Thomas swung the rod, pushing back the nearest shadow. It dissolved into mist, but quickly reformed. "They don't stay down for long," Thomas shouted. Rhea stepped forward. Her hand glowed even brighter. With a wave of blue energy pushed the creatures back. The largest creature roared. "Her power comes from the spark. She must not reach it." The ground cracked. A wide gap opened between Thomas and Rhea. "Rhea." Thomas reached for her hand. But the gap widened. Thomas jumped across just in time, grabbing Rhea's arm. Together, they stumbled forward. "We're almost there," Thomas shouted. The golden light from the core grew brighter. But the largest shadow creature moved to block their path. "You will not pass." Thomas glared at the creature. "Watch us." Rhea stepped forward. The glow from her hand turned white. The creature raised its arm, and darkness gathered around it. Light and shadow collided. The canyon shook harder. Thomas shielded his eyes from the bright flash. When the light faded, the largest creature staggered back. A deep crack ran through its chest. "No, the spark," too strong. Rhea raised both hands now. Her entire body glowed with soft blue and white light. Thomas stared in awe. Rhea. She looked at him, smiling softly. The creature roared one final time before dissolving into mist. The remaining shadows faded away with it. Silence returned to the canyon. Thomas dropped the rod and looked at Rhea. You did it. Rhea looked ahead. The golden light was now fully visible. The large, glowing crystal floated above a deep pit, the core of Solara. Thomas and Rhea walked toward it. As they approached, the crystal shined brighter, and a soft hum filled the air. Thomas looked at Rhea. This is it, the source. Rhea stepped forward. The glow from her body matched the light of the crystal. Thomas watched quietly. Slowly, Rhea raised her hand toward the crystal. The moment her hand touched the light, a wave of energy spread out, covering the canyon, the ruins, and the entire planet. Thomas fell to his knees, shielding his face from the bright light. When he opened his eyes, everything had changed. The canyon walls no longer looked broken. Soft green plants grew where there was once only dust. Thomas stood slowly. Rhea, he called out. Rhea stood at the center of the core. The light around her faded slowly, but she looked different. A soft glow still surrounded her. Her eyes shined like stars. Thomas stepped closer. Rhea, are you okay? Rhea smiled, warm and peaceful. The ground stopped shaking. Above them, the sky cleared. For the first time, Solara looked alive. Thomas turned in a slow circle. You did it. You brought it back. Rhea nodded. But her glowing form worried Thomas. Wait, you're not leaving, are you? He asked. Rhea shook her head. She reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm and steady. You're staying, Thomas whispered. Rhea smiled wider and nodded again. Thomas laughed softly. Good, because I wasn't going to leave without you. They stood together, looking at the now restored planet. Solara was no longer a dead world. Flowers bloomed along the canyon edges. The air felt fresh and clean. Thomas looked at Rhea. What now? Rhea pointed at the sky, where stars shined brightly. Thomas grinned. Right, the stars. There's more out there to see. Rhea nodded. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the rescue ship. The silver figure who had helped them stood waiting, its blue eyes glowing softly. Solara is safe once more, thanks to both of you, it said. Thomas smiled. We couldn't have done it without her. The figure looked at Rhea. The last spark of Solara lives on, with hope for the future. The ship's doors opened. Thomas looked at Rhea one last time, ready for the next adventure. Rhea gave a bright smile. Together, they stepped aboard. As the ship lifted into the stars, Solara shined brightly behind them, alive, beautiful, and full of new beginnings. The journey wasn't over. For Thomas and Rhea, it had just begun.